Well, hello there, guys. So, welcome to episode 2 of Open Opinions. So, this is an episode that I've honestly been thinking about for quite a while, and I didn't really, I guess, know exactly how to frame everything that's about to be said. And it's not like incriminating or like I'm about to say some fucking tea or anything like that. I just am going to be talking today specifically about mental health. And mental health is something that, unfortunately, by society, I feel is extremely overlooked and actually kind of stigmatized in a lot of ways. And I did kind of slightly touch on this in the last episode where I talked about like cannabis use and mental illness and how there is some kind of an overlap there just because, not because cannabis makes you mentally ill. It's not like smoking weed's going to make you go fucking crazy. But unfortunately, a lot of people that are mentally ill, people that are schizophrenic, people that are anxious, people that are depressed are going to look to self-medicate. And a lot of the time, the substances are going to be used is either cannabis or alcohol. And that's a pretty normalized thing. So I'm not saying that either of these substances like inherently cause addiction because that's ridiculous. And I think the gateway theory in itself is just the lack of understanding of addiction and mental health. Because what it kind of comes down to when it comes to drug addiction specifically related to mental health, you're not going to be using these substances that you inherently know are going to hurt and or kill you if you are not mentally ill, if you do not suffer or struggle through some kind of a mental illness. And it might be a slight mental disconnect, or it might be, something extremely, extremely major, and that's something we'll talk about later. But what I specifically kind of want to hone in on today is, I guess, just the like I said, the societal stigma surrounding mental health as a whole. As I even feel like people that are in these positions of like power and like influences and stuff, a lot of us have struggled with mental illness struggles or issues, and it's unfortunately just kind of something that we kind of push back and don't talk about. And I think it's because, like I said, societally, like if you claim, hey, I was once mentally ill, or I am suffering from mental illness, it's something that I'm struggling through every day, it's almost like society starts to delegitimize you. They're like, well, the thoughts that you're having are, they're mentally ill thoughts. They're not rational thoughts. They're not reasonable thoughts, which isn't always true. Like, yes, sometimes when you are extremely mentally ill and not treating it, like the thoughts you're having are not rational. The thoughts you're having are very outside yourself, and the thoughts you're having are, related to mental illness. But societally, we can't look at people that are mentally ill and disregard and be like, all of your thoughts are wrong. Because all of someone who mentally ill's thoughts are not going to be wrong. And honestly, people that are mentally ill probably have the most insight to mental illness than anyone else. Like, if you've never experienced this, and I can say this from looking at the scope of how I viewed mental illness prior to going through a couple of episodes, like, I didn't understand it. Like, there was legitimately just a huge misunderstanding, disconnects informationally as to what people that were suffering mentally ill were really suffering through. And at that, like, I didn't see the scope societally, like, how much mental illness affects all of us every day. There's probably several people in your life that their actions are affecting you negatively because they're mentally ill, and they are not even aware of it. Like, they personally can't even tell how, askew they really are. So in mental illness, please understand that there's a major disconnect from everything, from self, from society, from reality, from other people. So when you're talking and speaking with someone that's mentally ill that doesn't realize nor grasp nor want to change the scope of illness that they're dealing with, first off, there's a disconnect from them because they might not even realize they are even ill. They might not even realize that they are sick. And that's something that sometimes you have to have other people in your life check you on. And you kind of come to like a vast understanding of, holy shit, I'm way sicker than I thought I was. But unless you have someone in your life like that, like there's hundreds of thousands of millions of people that are operating every day, super mentally ill, and they don't recognize it nor are aware of such. And that's especially a problem because they don't realize the damage that they're, dealing in their entire life and the effect that it's having in their entire life. And like I was stating earlier, like the fact that people don't want to accept the fact that they dealt with mental illness, they don't want to be like, hey, I was once mentally ill. Like me coming to terms with this, I'll admit this today because this is not something that I feel lessens me or makes me weaker or like disenfranchises my points. I, several times in my life, have dealt with extreme mental illness. Like I have ADD. I have ADD very badly from mostly PTSD related events in my life in my childhood. Fucked up shit that happened growing up in the hood. Like just being straightforward. I saw death. I saw a lot of shit that I probably shouldn't had at a really young age. And that fucked me up long term into my adulthood. And it's something that in my adulthood, in my teenage years, I never dealt with. I was like, I'm fine. Fuck it. Like the stuff I saw was normal. The life I lived was normal. Nothing I lived was not normal. Because that was what I kind of deemed the normal life, and that's what societally was deemed normal. Is like, oh, you're gonna have struggle, you're gonna have pain, just get through it, which is so unhealthy. Because like, if you're mentally struggling, you need to speak your pains. You need to figure out why you're feeling those pains. You need to work through those pains. You need to overcome those pains. You need to know how those pains are going to affect you. Like the pain related in any event is something that needs to be dealt with. And unfortunately, like I said earlier, mental illness is disconnect. And one of the reasons I think people get so mentally ill is because disconnecting is easier than overcoming and getting through those issues. So like me stating times in my life, I've been suicidal. That's a really hard thing to have to admit. Having to admit that to my parents, having to admit that to my girlfriend, having to admit that to friends, like to my audience even, saying that to you guys. There is a like societal impact saying something like that you feel like you're going to be judged. And in some cases, I am going to be judged. And honestly, rightfully so. Like, I'm not saying judge mental illness, but when someone says to you, I've thought many times about committing suicide and how I was going to commit it and why I wanted to commit it, that's a really hard thing to hear. And it's a hard thing to try to have a scope on if you don't have a scope on mental illness. And it's something that I can say as someone who has dealt with that pain, who has overcome that pain. And I had to use medication. Prescription medication, without prescription medication, I don't think I'd be alive today. I can say that very straightforward. And there's cases 100% that prescription medication has killed people. There's definitely, especially in the opiate epidemic, where prescriptions are super unnecessary and people are just looking to fill and quench pain that isn't being quenched or filled because they're not overcoming their issues. But I have and still do take Adderall because there is a literal chemical imbalance in my head. I should not be having the thought, I want to kill myself. That's something that's a chemical imbalance in itself. Like, there's no rational, reasonable thought that is, I want to die. Like, even when you're dying, even when you're suicidal, a lot of the times, people will say they try to kill themselves and immediately regret it. Because your body and your cells, your brain even in mental illness, does not want to end living, does not want to end going forward, does not want to end life. So there's chemical imbalances that will literally tell you, you don't deserve to live today. You should kill yourself. There's no point in living. This pain's too much. Whatever it is. And chronic pain is definitely something that affects that. I can say that 100% with my GP. I think knowing the fact that I was going to be in constant chronic pain for the rest of my life was not something that was easy to overcome and deal with, especially when I was struggling through the depths of it. Like that was one of those times where like my brain was literally telling me like, there's no point in moving on. There's no point in going forward. There's no point in continuing. And that's such an ill thought. That's what I think I mostly look back on that with from a mentally healthy standpoint is like, that thought was nothing but mental illness. That thought was a very sick thought because I have a lot to live for. I had everything to live for. I still do have everything to live for. And my brain couldn't rationalize that scope. It was only rationalizing the pain that I was feeling and the chemical imbalance that was acting in my brain. And this chemical imbalance thing, it's literally just not understood by so many people. Like, there is people whose brains will tell them to kill themselves because they don't have XYZ, whatever that chemical is, serotonin, dopamine. It could even be like when in pregnancy states, it's also related to like, I can't think of the word. It's related to a lot of like specifically chemicals in our body. We have a lot of chemical processes going on in our body all the time that we are not even kind of aware of. So we need to realize that some people can have imbalances. And when someone gets suicidal, when someone gets depressed, when someone gets sad, when someone gets, in that state, that's not a state of weakness. That's literally a state of illness. It's a state of sickness. When someone has the flu, especially if it's someone you love, you don't just like contemptively leave them and like be like, oh, fuck them, like whatever. Like if your girlfriend or your wife or your husband or your whatever friend has the flu, you make them soup. Like, yeah, you try not to contract it yourself, but you try to help them progress. And like societally, mental illness is not looked at like that. Depression, anxiety, like there is some things that like we have kind of as a society been trying to adapt into normalcy, but I almost feel like that's kind of harmful because now every person who feels a slight amount of worry is anxious, and every person who feels a slight amount of sadness is depressed. And I'm not trying to detract from the fact that we are societally trying to normalize those things, but no, not everyone that is sad is depressed, and not everyone that, is nervous is anxious. Like these are some things that people experience every single second of every single day. And it affects interactions, and it affects their career, and it affects their relationships, and it affects their everything. So, like, we also, as a society, I think, need to normalize mental illness. And I'm not saying that we should just let mentally ill people exist as mentally ill. Like, that's absurd. That's just as harmful as stigmatizing it and stereotyping it. But I think that, like, we need to look at this from a little bit more of an outside scope, especially people who have never experienced mental illness themselves. And they need to realize that people that are addicted to drugs are probably mentally ill. The level of disconnect that it takes to take a substance that could literally kill you immediately is mental illness. People that are in the privatized prison system a lot of the time are mentally ill because they're from a poor community that doesn't have the resources necessary to take care of mental health and mental illness. They might not have the correct, figures in their life to raise them to get the help they need. When it comes to poor communities, there's a lot of things that are fucked up in, and that's 100 episodes by themselves. But specifically, poor and middle-class communities are being ravaged and torn apart by mental illness every day. Because a lot of people in jail today are mentally ill. A lot of the drug addicts are mentally ill. A lot of homeless people are mentally ill. And stigmatizing negatively all of those categories, which we do as an American society, doesn't help us at all. Because it's just those numbers will keep growing. It's a cycle. It's a repetitive cycle. Like, the privatized prison cycle is a repetitive cycle. You get put in jail, you're probably going to spend a lot of time in jail. And the same thing exists for like I said, like homelessness and addicts and a lot of other, things in American society. We're not looking as an American society to help people that are mentally ill. We're looking to push them away. It's like an all for yourself type mentality. It's like, well, I'm fine, so I might as well take care of myself. No. In the same way that homeless person that walks up to you and asks for $5 on the street, and you're like, fuck them, I don't want them to do drugs. Are you fucking kidding me? You're telling me that if you were so mentally ill, and you probably don't have this scope, you probably just don't if you feel that way. But if you were so mentally ill that you had to beg some other human being for money to eat, and that was your reality every day, was begging to try to get out of the fucked up situation that your brain probably put you in. And yes, you do have to take responsibility. But at the same time, mental illness is it almost is a lack of responsibility, because you have no self-worth. You have no self-motivation. You have no anything. Mental illness is a lack of self. That's what society needs to understand. So judging in any negative way, any decision that you deem that some mentally ill person made, yes, they made that decision 100%. But unfortunately, in the disconnect that is rooted in mental illness, you don't realize, and if you do realize, you don't care about the effects of that decision that you made. So look at European countries that treat drug addicts as sick people. Look at the success rates for rehabilitation. And then look at America in the midst of an opiate epidemic, because no one knows how to deal with their physical and mental and emotional pain. They just want to quelch it and take some fucking substance to make them feel good. All the opiate epidemic is people that are mentally ill looking for a state of bliss and euphoria. Same thing with extreme alcoholism. That's not some fucking really shit choice you made to pick up the bottle. Like, yes, if you're coming at this from a sober living stance, like, okay, I guess they chose to not be sober, probably rooted in pain. You're disconnected. Like, so much of this societal negative view is rooted in nothing but disconnect and never having been in a situation like that. And that's kind of what privilege is in some ways. Like, I was once one that heard the word privilege and was like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, I grew up in a really poor neighborhood. Like, I didn't a lot of times in my life feel like I was afforded the privileges that everyone talked about. But like, looking at it entirely objectively, there's so many privileges even being a low income white male affords me that many of my friends that I grew up with didn't get, weren't afforded, weren't literally because of the color of their skin or because of, you know, how they looked, how they spoke, how they acted. There's a disconnect. And like I said earlier, like, privilege in therapy and in healing of mental health plays a very large part in our society today. Even as someone who is extremely, like, I grew up low income, I grew up poor, I grew up with no resources to mental health or anything like that. But later in life, I'm able to, you know, find a path that I was able to get out of that. Unfortunately, a lot of people I grew up with didn't. Like, the path that they took was either a path of addiction or the privatized prison system, because mental health and lack of mental health resources made them make a lot of decisions that were outside themselves, that were disconnected from themselves, and that they really didn't have a choice over. And the reason this makes me especially so sad is we look back into like the privatized prison system specifically. There's people that are 35 in jail that did now get the mental resources they needed, because funny enough, jail has more mental resources than free society today. That's fucked, but true. So I see people at 30 just now realizing the scope of their decisions and, you know, what they did and how it affected them, because they're just now coming to mental clarity. Rehabilitation in a lot of these situations is just mental clarity. Because pain, mental illness, I've said this a thousand times, it's like a bucket in our heads. We have emotions, and that emotions, it's in a bucket. And that bucket, everything we feel drops a little drip of water in. Like, that bucket slowly filling and filling and filling and filling as we're thinking, as we're feeling emotion, as we're, you know, living. And once you stop failing to recognize that bucket's filling, that bucket's going to overflow. That bucket's going to slowly drop by drop by drop by drop by drop, eventually get full and overflow. And the way that manifests itself in a lot of people is terrible. It's crime. It's addiction. It's, doing something they didn't want to do because either they're perpetuating an abuse that they felt earlier in their life, or they're not dealing with whatever the fuck it is that they're, hurting and struggling through. And it's very true that people who suffer from mental illness go one of two ways. Like, there's either, and we'll use like an abusive child situation here. Like, if there was a kid that was abused as a kid, there's two paths that kid's going to take. Either he's going to be the best fucking parent there ever was. Like, he's going to make sure that exactly the childhood that they lived is the opposite that their kids live. Or they're going to hide and not feel that pain and unfortunately probably perpetuate it throughout their life. And that's what not dealing with that bucket does to you, is makes you not, you just have to realize the scope of what you're dealing with. And it's especially hard because there is a want to disconnect. Mental illness naturally comes with a want to disconnect. And I think one of the main things, I heard a lot of people say this a lot of times before, and I felt like it didn't really have an important scope to me, or it didn't matter to me. I didn't listen to it. But you need to find someone to speak your pains to speak things through with. Because by putting them out there, by laying these ideas out on a linear path, you're able to figure out, one, how a lot of this probably wasn't your fault. It wasn't something you did. So that mental game you're playing with yourself of, why was I in that situation? Why did that happen to me? Why was it? Why? That's dangerous. The why creates pain, creates anxiety, creates terrible thoughts. And I'm not saying that when you're thinking that why, you have to make a decision and be like, that's why. Because in that why state, you're not going to be thinking, super clearly. But it really helps having an objective person, a therapist, a girlfriend, a friend. Call someone from the suicide hotline. Literally, there's so many resources that just allow you to speak things through. And that's so much more important than most of us are ever going to realize. And unfortunately, if you're in a position of, maybe you're like the boyfriend that's the rock in the relationship and your girlfriend's struggling, or in my situation, and I think a lot of other influencers' situation, it's like, I'm this positive light. Like, I don't want to show my audience reality is what it is. Like, there's a scaredness. Mental illness does come with an ashamed motive. Like, I can 1,000% say, in my state of mental illness, I was scared, I was nervous, and I was very ashamed, because like, I was afforded a life that everyone would want to live. I live a very lucky, crazy, privileged, the list goes on and on and on life. Like, yeah, my past was rooted in shit, but like, the life I live now is pretty fucking awesome. And that's something that for a long time, like, because I'm living the life I do now, I felt very guilty about still being mentally ill, about still struggling, about still, I don't know, it's just like a feeling of like letting you down, letting your audience down, letting other people down, letting your family down, letting your girlfriend down, letting whoever it is down. It's like an overall feeling of letting other people down because you're feeling your pain. And that's not something that should ever be felt. Because what's really going to affect and hurt the people around you is you just hiding that constantly and letting it bubble up and affect your life negatively, because it will. No matter what you do, who you are, how you run from it, it will rear its head. So it's way better in any given situation to, yes, maybe take a step away and calm yourself down and get, control of your emotions, but then confront the situation. Confront why you're feeling that way. Confront why those feelings were brought up, and confront how you can change that next time. Because, still to this day, yes, and Kristen will be the first person to, back this. I have triggers. I have really shitty days. There's days where I'm not super happy and confident and doing great, and that's literally just chemical imbalance and mental illness. And like I said, I still do take a small dose of Adderall every day to think normally and to hopefully get my brain back onto a normal thought pattern. I definitely don't plan on taking it the rest of my life, nor do I think I'm supposed to, or will I have to. But I also see the help that it gave me getting back onto a normal path of mental thinking, of mental clarity. And Adderall especially is one of those things that you talk about it in college and all these kids are like, oh man, I took an Adderall and was up for 48 hours. I remember the first time I took Vyvanse in college, I was writing a paper and I took a pretty hearty dose and was super normal. Wasn't racy, wasn't oh, I gotta get everything done. I ended up watching YouTube videos and passing out by 9 p.m. And I probably should have in that specific instance realized that's when I probably had an ADD situation or a chemical imbalance, but I didn't. And I just kind of wrote that off as whatever. I'm apparently really tolerant to drugs because I'm a redhead. And that actually is kind of true. I do have a very high tolerance to most drugs. I can drink a lot of people under the table, even with a gastrointestinal disorder, because my alcohol tolerance is high. And you guys have seen 1,000 times with THC, I'm not trying to get braggadocious, but I can smoke a fucking shit ton of weed. There's literally no limit that I'm reaching that I'm uncomfortable at. So I think that I arrogantly was oh, I must just have a really high ginger drug tolerance, not realizing that it was just a literal probably chemical imbalance, and that the reason I was struggling so much in school, I've never been a good student. I've always been a C student, and I've always struggled with homework, and I've always struggled getting into tasks that I don't care about or want to do. The thing that teachers told me all the time in high school was, you're super fucking smart. You just need to push yourself. You need to push yourself. You don't want to do this. You just need to push yourself. And that's super true. My entire life, if I don't want to do it, if it's not something I'm super passionate about, then I'm gonna be I'll do it, but it's not my first major important priority. And that's something that specifically being on medication has really helped with, is there's a lot of things every day that I don't want to do that I just have to do. And there's a lot of things that are uncomfortable in life that you have to just do and state and experience and go through. And looping all the way back around, I think a lot of, at least for me, my mental illness and my mental pain was not, I guess, realizing how to deal and really overcome with things I'm feeling, and specifically pain. I don't like pain. I'll be the first person to say that, as someone who's experienced, many chronic surgeries and ailments and all that. Pain sucks. And I'm really glad that I have a nauseous inclination and nauseous, when I take opiates, I feel like shit, no matter what the opiate is. That makes me very happy, because opiates scare the fuck out of me. That's something that I think if I was prone to taking a lot of, I probably would, just because I've been on opiates and they worked, but I was a zombie. I did nothing all the time, and I was so okay with it. So that's where, you do have to mentally check yourself and be is the substance that I'm using actually offering me benefit, or am I justifying my use for some other reason just because I'm in pain and don't want to be, or, whatever the fuck it is. And that was specifically a substance that I really caught that with, is opiates are dangerous. There's a reason that so many people die every day in this fucking country from opiates, because they're extremely addictive. And honestly, a lot of the properties related to opiates and stuff like that are stuff that people blindly jump into. They're like, well, I hurt my leg. Fuck it. I guess I'm going to start taking these opiates long term. Opiates are not meant for long-term pain management. They're meant for extremely short-term, weeks mostly, management of very specific ailments, most of them involving extreme pain. And if it's a localized thing like a muscle pain or like a bone, that's what opiates are for. It's a localized, very specific, very time-treated ailment that you should treat for like a week and stop taking opiates. Taper, obviously, because the effects of them are super dangerous. But I think that honestly plays into all prescription drugs. Like, this is the point that I'm trying to make here. Prescription drugs are extremely helpful for a lot of people. Like, change their life for the better, if not the reason that they are alive today. I can honestly say that one of the main reasons I'm alive today is because of Adderall. Like, I don't think that without some kind of medication intervention, my chemical imbalance would have been treated. Like, I was not thinking normally. My thought process was terrible. And this happened several times in my life. There was times in my life where I was able to, with cannabis alone and a lot of meditation, also get out of these states. But the last one I experienced, especially, I just felt like it was something I couldn't do alone. So the point I'm trying to make is that medication is something that's also stigmatized. People see pharmaceuticals and they're like, fuck big pharma. Which, yeah, fuck big pharma and the negative effects they have on abuse of prescription drugs. Because that's a huge issue in America today, is people abusing the fuck out of their prescriptions. They get their script and it's gone in a week, and then they have to buy it from the streets. If you're ever going through your script fast enough to have to buy it for the streets, you're abusing your substance. You're abusing your drug, and you should not be using it. That's where the issue unfortunately lies, is we are a society that stigmatizes and negatively stigmatizes drug use. We have a very regulated flow of drugs in our country. If it's not illegal and it's not a hard drug, it's not something like heroin or coke. Especially pharmaceuticals are very regulated, but there's still something that's abused. And the pipeline is doctor to street to illegal substance. And that's not because there's a gateway. That's because there's a mental illness that is underlying, that is overtaking and overshadowing all the person's thoughts. And opiates specifically, it goes from prescription pills to heroin, usually is the street option. And that's usually when people die because it's laced with fentanyl, or they just take too much heroin because it's fucking heroin and they die. Or it goes on to fentanyl and the opiate analgesics or whatever the fuck they are. Then we also have, yes, there's a inherent Adderall problem in college students today. There's a lot of people who don't need to be taking Adderall that take it every single day. And if you do not have a chemical imbalance in your brain and you are taking an excessive amount of dopamine or serotonin or whatever the fuck it is, if you're, modifying your brain chemistry when your brain chemistry is not illegitimate and in the wrong, there's going to be negative effects. You are taking an amphetamine every single day with a brain that does not require amphetamine use. So symptoms are going to exacerbate. Psychosis is very possible, especially if there's excessive cannabis consumption. And it's looked at negatively, the same way that opiates are stigmatized. Opiate abuse is very bad. Adderall abuse is very bad. Abuse of any fucking pill. SSRI abuse is bad. There's no pill that abusing and self-prescribing is the correct method or means of going about consumption. Pharmaceuticals should be heavily regulated, by medical consumers and doctors. And you should also be pretty personally checking yourself as well with any substance you use ever. It's this whole responsibility thing that we get into with substance all the time. Like, is it affecting your life negatively? Is it affecting your life positively? Are you lying about the negative effects? Are you undermining the negative effects? Like, what are the negative effects this is having on you, either mentally or physically? That's what we should basically be thinking with every medication. And we just can't stigmatize this use of substances because it saves the life of a lot of people. There's diabetics that need insulin every day. There's, people that have extreme ADD that, if I wouldn't have treated my chemical imbalance or depression or anxiety, whatever it is, would have very well likely ended up taking their own lives, which is something that none of us want to do. Yes, yet again, I was once in my life suicidal. I never want to take my own life. Ever. I look at this rationally. That thought sickens me. I get a pit in the fucking middle of my stomach because that was even a thought that I had. I didn't think of the effects. I didn't think of the recourse. I didn't think of anything. Because like I said, it's an extreme level of disconnect in mental illness that society just doesn't get. And we do lose a lot of people to suicide and to drug abuse and to whatever the fuck you want to say. There's a lot of things we lose a lot of people to every single day. And societally, by continuing this stupid stigmatization the same way that we do with weed, we're killing people. By tweeting, "Oh man, I wish I could have helped," after someone dies, and then not changing your views or how you view mental illness or why this happened or how this can be prevented in the future, or without having any long-term preventative thoughts, this is just going to keep happening honestly at a more profound rate. It's like someone dies and we talk about it for 1 or 2 days and then it's just gone. It's out of the media loop and we're not paying attention to it, which is the last thing we should be doing. By actually proactively recognizing that mental illness is a fucking big issue in our country right now. And it's not being touched. It's being looked at negatively. It's being very, very, very heavily continued to be stigmatized. People will keep killing themselves over and over and over. Drug addicts will keep dying. Homeless people will still, they'll keep being fucking homeless. They'll keep perpetuating all these things that society is deeming incorrect, which realistically, it's just people that are sick. It's people that we need to help. It's people that we're not helping because we are being lied to as to why they got to where they did. Think about it like this. Society for a long time told you a lot about weed that was really incorrect, extremely incorrect. And they deemed that as factual information. The same thing exists today, and it's especially happening with mental illness because people are actively trying to stereotype and negatively demean people that are sick and struggling instead of helping them. And it's not society's job to, fix everyone. But at the same time, as someone who's mentally not ill, as someone who's mentally in a good place, I personally do think it kind of is your position. It kind of is your prerogative to help someone who might not be in that same position. I didn't choose to be mentally ill, ever. It's something that because of my shitty upbringing and past and stuff that I literally didn't control, it affects me every day now. And that's the same for millions of people in American society. Yet society stigmatizes and negatively demeans them for feeling how they do and being in the position that they are, when most of the time it's a position they had no control over. So I guess I'll end this with an easy statement about privilege, because it's something that so many people, I hate saying this, especially so many white people, white males. I sound like a fucking liberal. But like white males really do hate hearing the word privilege, and I hated it for a long time too because I didn't understand it. Being mentally sane, eating, having a job, doing anything that you can pay your bills. Yeah, you might not be ahead of everyone else. You might not be a rich Dan Blizzard, the fuck his name is. Like, you're not 100 millionaire, but you're living and existing, and your existence is not constant, worry and pain about not only you, but the people around you. Like, people that are living extremely, low income shit lives, they don't even get to deal with their own mental pain because they have 6 people to support around them. That's where all their time and shit's being put to. So, like, if you have the time, find the time, find somewhere to take the time to either talk to someone or try to talk through yourself with your own issues. Because running from pain and hiding from pain result in a lot of us creating more pain for everyone around us and for ourselves. And by not recognizing the fact that a lot of us are in pain, it's a huge disservice to everyone, those that are and aren't. Because we're not all on the same level of happiness all the time. And it's not always as easy as just get happy. Like, sometimes being in a privileged position of mental health, yes, it is your duty to listen to someone that's struggling because you can't help them. And that can literally be the listening ear that they needed to change their entire life. So I know we're going to see these tweets for the next fucking 2 months because Mac died. Look out for your friends. But, like, look out for your fucking friends. If you recognize a friend that's in any way struggling, reach out. Don't expect them to reach out because in a state of mental illness, it's really hard to do. Look out for your friends. It's look out for your friends season. 2018, 2019 is look out for the people around you season. Because it's really important to have people that look out for you while you're looking out for them. That's how we all stay alive. And I know that's like a over the top, like blown out type of idea or view, but it's also, I think it's one that needs to be said. Like, the reason that I call this podcast Open Opinions, the reason that I'm going to have open opinions is because a lot of opinions don't want to be stated today. A lot of people are scared to state opinions. A lot of people are worried to state opinions. And I get it. We live in a society that, like, when you have opinions, you're going to get demeaned. You're going to get degraded. People that don't agree with you aren't going to see you as just having an opinion. They're going to feel personally attacked. So I get the scope of the negative effect it can have. It doesn't mean I'll ever not state them, though. Because this is something that needs to be said. We need to actually fix our societal view on mental health because it's really fucked up. But one quick CBD dab to call this an episode, guys. Cheers. Stay positive. Stay medicated. Peace, guys. I love you all. Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba.